HOA Karen called cops when I refused to give her free gas. Too bad, I'm the police chief. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you one quick favor. Let me know where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach, and I truly appreciate every single one of you for being here. Now, without further delay, let's meet the person at the center of today's unforgettable story. The fastest way to expose someone who worships power is to calmly tell them no. That lesson found me on a bright Saturday morning when I pulled my old silver pickup into a neighborhood gas station just after sunrise, expecting nothing more exciting than filling up my tank before heading home to mow the lawn. The air carried the familiar smell of fresh gasoline mixed with hot coffee drifting from the convenience store, while country music played softly through weathered outdoor speakers that had probably been hanging there for years. A gentle breeze pushed across the lot, making the small American flags near the pumps flutter against a perfectly blue sky. It should have been an ordinary morning, the kind you forget before lunchtime. Instead, it became the day one woman reminded an entire community that arrogance can be loud, but the truth never needs to raise its voice. I had parked beside Pump 4 and just finished inserting my credit card when a spotless black luxury SUV rolled up beside me. The vehicle practically sparkled in the morning sunlight, polished so carefully it reflected every cloud overhead. Before the engine was even off, the driver's door swung open with purpose. A woman stepped out wearing expensive sunglasses, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the unmistakable expression of someone who believed every place she entered already belonged to her. She glanced once at me, once at the pump, then walked over as though she were approaching an employee instead of another customer. "You can go ahead and fill mine up after you're done," she said, pointing toward her SUV without introducing herself. "The HOA covers community services, so this one is on you." I looked at her for a second, honestly wondering whether she was joking. "I'm sorry," I replied with a polite smile. "I don't own the station, and I'm just buying gas for myself." She lowered her sunglasses just enough for me to see the irritation in her eyes. "You live in Willow Creek Estates, don't you?" she asked. I recognized that truck. I nodded carefully. "Yes, I do." Her smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that expected obedience. "Then you know who I am. I'm Linda Harper, president of the HOA. Community businesses cooperate with us. Residents support one another. Go ahead and fill it up." I shook my head. "Respectfully, that's not how gas stations work, and I can't buy fuel for someone I don't know." Her face hardened almost instantly. The cheerful Saturday atmosphere seemed to disappear beneath the weight of her disappointment that someone had dared decline her request. She folded her arms and stepped closer. "Are you refusing a direct request from the HOA?" she asked loudly enough that two customers near the front entrance turned to watch. "I'm refusing to pay for someone else's gasoline," I answered calmly. "That's all." She laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "People like you always regret making things difficult." Without another word, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, and began recording me. "Everyone should see how uncooperative this resident is," she announced dramatically, making sure nearby customers could hear every word. "This man is harassing me and interfering with community operations." I simply continued pumping my own gas, letting the numbers slowly climb across the digital display. I had learned years earlier that some people become even louder when silence refuses to argue with them. Linda seemed determined to prove that point. She paced beside the pumps, narrating the situation into her phone as though she were reporting a major public emergency instead of being told she needed to purchase her own fuel. Then she stopped recording, tapped a different number, and held the phone confidently against her ear. I caught only a few words before she raised her voice again. "Yes, I'd like officers sent immediately," she said. "There's an aggressive man refusing to cooperate and creating a disturbance at the gas station. I need police assistance right now." Several people looked toward me with uncertain expressions. One elderly couple quietly moved to another pump. A young cashier pressed his face against the store window, obviously wondering what was happening outside. Linda ended the call with a satisfied smile, slipped her phone back into her purse, and looked directly at me as though she had already won. "You should have just bought the gas," she said confidently. "The police will handle the rest." I glanced at the fuel nozzle in my hand. then back at her without changing my expression. "If that's what you believe," I said quietly, "then we'll wait together." Linda folded her arms with the confidence of someone who had spent years watching people back down the moment she mentioned the letters H, O, and A. She was expecting the familiar pattern, an apology, an excuse, maybe even an offer to pay just to make the confrontation disappear. Instead, I quietly returned the fuel nozzle to the pump after my tank clicked full, replaced my gas cap, and collected my receipt, as if the most dramatic thing happening that morning was deciding whether I wanted another cup of coffee before heading home. That calm seemed to bother her far more than any argument ever could. "Do not even think about leaving," she announced loudly. "The officers need to hear exactly what you did." I looked at her and answered in the same even tone I had used from the beginning. "I have no problem waiting." Her eyebrows lifted for just a second, almost as though she had expected me to panic. When I did not, she immediately switched strategies. She raised her voice so everyone near the pumps could hear every word. "This man threatened me after I asked for assistance. He is refusing to cooperate with the homeowners association. People like this make neighborhoods unsafe." I noticed several customers glance in my direction before looking away again. Most people do not enjoy becoming accidental witnesses to public confrontations. They simply want to finish their errands and go home. Still, curiosity has a way of slowing everyone down. A father filling his family SUV stopped squeezing the handle. A delivery driver remained inside his van with the window halfway down. Even the young cashier stepped outside, pretending to straighten the windshield washer buckets while quietly observing everything that was unfolding. Linda noticed the growing audience and seemed energized by it. She lifted her phone once more and resumed recording. "This is exactly what residents have to deal with," she declared dramatically. "Businesses and individuals who refuse to support the community." I almost smiled at that sentence because nothing she had said matched what had actually happened. I had simply declined to buy gasoline for a complete stranger. Yet by carefully changing a few words, she had transformed an ordinary disagreement into something that sounded much larger. I had seen that technique before. Facts become less important when someone is determined to control the story before the truth has a chance to arrive. She pointed directly toward my pickup. "I know where you live," she said. "Your address is already in our records. You are going to discover very quickly what happens when you disrespect this neighborhood." I nodded once. Everyone deserves to be treated respectfully. She seemed surprised that I had not responded to the threat itself. Instead of calming down, she became more animated. "You think this is funny?" she demanded. "I have spent years protecting property values around here. I know every contractor, every board member, every officer assigned to this district. They all know me." There was something revealing about that last sentence. She did not describe partnerships or friendships. She described influence, as though knowing people's names automatically gave her authority over their decisions. While she continued speaking, I quietly slipped my receipt into my wallet. The time printed across the top caught my attention for a brief second. Old habits are difficult to forget. Details matter. Time matters. Paper trails matter. Those little pieces often tell the most accurate version of any story. A few feet away, the station's security cameras slowly rotated above the canopy, silently capturing every conversation, every vehicle, and every movement across the property. Linda never looked up at them once. She was completely focused on the audience standing around us. "Do you see this?" she called toward the other customers. "He thinks the rules do not apply to him." An older gentleman wearing a baseball cap finally spoke. "Ma'am, from where I am standing, he just bought his own gas." Linda turned sharply toward him. "Nobody asked for your opinion." The man shrugged and returned to his truck without another word. That brief exchange changed the atmosphere. Until then, everyone had remained silent observers. Now a few people began quietly exchanging uncertain looks. The story Linda was presenting no longer fit what they had personally watched unfold over the last several minutes. She sensed that shift immediately and became even more determined to keep control. She pulled out a leather folder from her SUV, flipped it open just enough for everyone nearby to notice official-looking documents inside, and held it against her side like a badge of authority. "The Homeowners Association has agreements that you obviously do not understand," she insisted while looking directly at me. "Once the officers arrive, they will explain your responsibilities." I simply answered, "If there is an agreement, I am sure they will want to verify it before reaching any conclusions. That response seemed to frustrate her more than anything else because it offered nothing to argue against. The distant sound of approaching sirens drifted through the morning air, growing slightly louder with every passing second. Linda smiled with unmistakable satisfaction, convinced that the next few minutes would end exactly the way she had imagined from the moment she reached for her telephone. I remained standing beside my old pickup, hands relaxed at my sides, watching two familiar patrol vehicles slowly turn into the gas station parking lot as the crowd instinctively stepped back to make room for their arrival. The two patrol cruisers rolled slowly beneath the gas station canopy, their light bars dark and their engines humming softly before coming to a smooth stop a few yards away. The quiet conversations around us faded almost instantly. People who had been pretending not to watch suddenly found reasons to remain exactly where they were. Linda straightened her posture, adjusted the collar of her tailored jacket, and smiled with the confidence of someone expecting validation rather than an investigation. Before either officer had fully stepped out of the vehicles, she was already waving both arms to get their attention. "Officers, over here," she called loudly. "I am so glad you are finally here." The two patrol officers approached at an unhurried pace, carefully scanning the scene before speaking to anyone. That alone told me they were following their training instead of letting the loudest voice control the situation. One was a younger officer named Daniel Brooks, someone I had watched grow from a police academy graduate into a dependable patrol officer. Beside him was Officer Rachel Collins, calm, observant, and known throughout the department for taking careful notes before reaching conclusions. Neither of them showed the slightest sign of rushing to judgment. Linda stepped directly toward them before they could ask a single question. "This man has been causing problems," she declared while pointing toward me. "He refused to cooperate, became confrontational, and is interfering with community operations. I need him removed from the property." Officer Collins looked briefly toward me before returning her attention to Linda. "Ma'am," she said politely, "we will speak with everyone involved." Linda nodded impatiently, but continued talking anyway. "There is really nothing else to investigate. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I know exactly what happened." Officer Brooks finally spoke. "We still need to hear every side." His voice remained respectful, but firm enough to remind everyone that they would decide how the conversation proceeded. Linda crossed her arms again, clearly disappointed that the officers had not immediately accepted her version of events. They turned toward me next. Officer Collins offered a professional smile. "Sir, would you mind telling us what happened today?" I kept my answer simple. "I stopped for gasoline on my way home. Ms. Harper asked me to pay for her fuel. I declined. She called law enforcement." Neither officer interrupted. They listened without writing anything yet, allowing each sentence to finish naturally. Linda could not contain herself. "That is not what happened," she interrupted. "He is leaving out the important parts." Officer Brooks raised one hand slightly. "Ma'am, you will have another opportunity to speak, but please allow him to finish." She exhaled dramatically and looked toward the growing crowd, as if hoping someone would rescue her argument. I continued calmly. "There was no physical confrontation, no threats, no property damage. We have both remained here waiting for your arrival." Officer Collins glanced toward the fuel pumps, then toward the station building where several security cameras overlooked the entire parking lot. "Thank you," she said. "Please remain here while we gather information." Linda immediately stepped closer to the officers again. "There is no reason to waste time reviewing cameras," she insisted. "Everyone already knows what happened." The station manager, a middle-aged man wearing a blue uniform shirt with a stitched name tag reading Carl, finally walked outside. He had remained near the entrance since the situation began, but now approached carefully. "Officers," he said, "our cameras recorded everything if you need them." Linda quickly turned toward him. "There is no need for that," she answered before either officer could respond. Carl blinked in surprise. "With respect, ma'am, they can decide whether they need it." That brief exchange did not go unnoticed. Officer Collins made her first note inside a small notebook, while Officer Brooks quietly looked across the station canopy, mentally tracing where each camera was positioned. Linda seemed increasingly uncomfortable every time someone suggested verifying facts instead of accepting opinions. She opened her leather folder again and removed several printed pages bearing the Homeowners Association logo. holding them out confidently. She said, "These community guidelines explain our relationship with local businesses." Officer Brooks accepted the papers politely, but did not immediately read them. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Does this gas station participate in this agreement?" Linda hesitated for the first time that morning. "Well, everyone understands how these things work." "Do you have documentation signed by the business owner?" he asked. She shifted her weight slightly. "I do not have it with me." Carl looked genuinely confused. "I have managed this station for 6 years," he said. "We have never had any agreement to provide free gasoline to anyone." A quiet murmur spread through the customers standing nearby. The confidence that had surrounded Linda only minutes earlier began to weaken almost imperceptibly. She looked from Carl to the officers and then back toward me, searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. I remained exactly where I had been since the patrol cars arrived, saying nothing unless I was asked a direct question. Officer Collins closed her notebook for a moment and studied my face with an expression that changed almost too quickly to notice. It was not surprise. It was recognition. She did not say anything immediately, but I could see the subtle shift in her eyes as though an important memory had just fallen into place. Across from her, Officer Brooks looked at me again, this time a little longer than before, his expression slowly mirroring the same realization, while Linda continued speaking without noticing that the entire direction of the morning was quietly beginning to change. Officer Collins kept her notebook lowered at her side, but I could almost see the gears turning behind her calm expression. Recognition rarely arrives all at once. It begins as a feeling that something is familiar, followed by a detail that refuses to fit the picture everyone else is seeing. Officer Brooks experienced the same hesitation. His eyes briefly settled on the worn leather key ring resting beside my truck keys. Attached to it was a simple metal challenge coin that most people would mistake for an ordinary keepsake. To the average person, it meant nothing. To someone inside our department, it was unmistakable. Neither officer reacted outwardly. Their professionalism never changed. That was exactly what years of training were supposed to accomplish. They continued treating the situation like every other routine call, gathering information one step at a time instead of jumping to conclusions. Linda, however, mistook their silence for agreement. She smiled confidently and stepped closer again. "I appreciate both of you handling this so quickly," she said. "People need to understand that our community has standards. When someone refuses to cooperate, there have to be consequences." Officer Brooks glanced toward her. "We are still determining exactly what happened, ma'am." She laughed lightly as though he had misunderstood the situation. "There really is not much to determine. I asked him to help support the neighborhood. He became difficult. I called you. It is very straightforward." The station manager quietly cleared his throat. "That is not exactly how I remember it." Linda shot him a look sharp enough to silence most people, but Carl simply folded his arms and remained where he was. He had spent years dealing with impatient customers, and his expression suggested he was no longer interested in letting anyone rewrite what he had personally witnessed. Officer Collins walked a few steps toward the convenience store entrance and looked up at the security cameras mounted beneath the canopy. "Carl," she asked politely, "are those cameras recording continuously?" He nodded immediately. "Every pump, 24 hours a day. Audio around the entrance, video across the entire lot." "Excellent," she replied. Linda interrupted almost before the sentence ended. "That really will not be necessary. We have already spent enough time on this." Officer Collins looked back at her with the same courteous expression she had maintained since arriving. "Whenever there is recorded evidence available, we prefer to review it." Linda forced a smile that failed to hide the growing tension in her face. "Of course," she answered. "I just thought we could save everyone some time." The words sounded reasonable, but they arrived a little too quickly. People who know the facts are usually comfortable letting evidence speak for itself. People who rely on assumptions often become impatient when facts begin entering the conversation. While Officer Collins spoke quietly with Carl about accessing the recordings, Officer Brooks remained near me. He studied my face once more before his eyes drifted back to the challenge coin attached to my keys. "Interesting key chain," he said casually. "Thank you," I replied. "It has been with me for quite a few years." He gave a slight nod without asking another question. I could tell he was trying to place where he had seen it before. Across the parking lot, Linda resumed speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I work with city officials all the time, she announced. Our association has excellent relationships with law enforcement. We all want the same thing, a safe neighborhood. Nobody responded. The small audience had changed noticeably during the last several minutes. Earlier, they had watched with curiosity. Now they watched with caution, waiting to see where the facts would lead instead of following whoever spoke the loudest. A young delivery driver quietly whispered something to the older gentleman in the baseball cap. Both glanced toward the security cameras and then back toward Linda. The confidence she had displayed when the patrol cars first arrived no longer seemed quite as convincing. Officer Collins returned carrying a small business card Carl had handed her. The owner can provide the video immediately, she said to Officer Brooks. Everything from the first contact until now is preserved. Brooks nodded. Good. Let us document everything properly. Linda let out an impatient sigh. Are we seriously going to spend all morning over a tank of gasoline? Officer Collins answered with complete composure. This is no longer about gasoline. It is about understanding exactly what occurred. Those words settled over the parking lot with surprising weight. For the first time since the confrontation began, Linda seemed uncertain about what to say next. She adjusted her sunglasses even though they were already perfectly in place. She glanced toward her sport utility vehicle, then toward the growing crowd, then finally back toward the officers. Officer Brooks looked at me again, this time with unmistakable recognition beginning to replace uncertainty. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly before he quickly caught himself, determined not to interrupt the investigation or embarrass anyone prematurely. He leaned slightly toward Officer Collins and quietly said something too soft for anyone else to hear. She looked back at me one more time, her expression changing from curiosity to certainty. Neither officer announced what they had realized. Instead, they continued following procedure exactly as they had been trained, while Linda remained completely unaware that the story she believed she was directing was only moments away from taking a direction she had never imagined. Officer Brooks took one slow breath before looking directly at me again. The uncertainty had disappeared from his face, replaced by quiet confidence. He did not rush. He did not make a dramatic announcement. He simply followed the same professional standards that every officer in our department was expected to follow, regardless of who happened to be standing in front of them. Sir, he said respectfully, before we continue, may I ask you a question? I nodded. Of course. Have we met before? A faint smile crossed my face. Several times. He looked almost embarrassed for a brief moment. I thought so. Officer Collins turned fully toward me, studying me one final time before speaking. I believe I know who you are as well. Around us, the station grew strangely quiet. Even the traffic moving along the road beyond the pumps seemed distant compared to the silence settling over the parking lot. Linda looked from one officer to the other, clearly confused by the change in their tone. What is going on? She asked impatiently. Are you going to deal with this or not? Officer Collins did not answer immediately. Instead, she took one measured step forward and addressed me with the same respect she would show inside headquarters. Good morning, Chief Walker. The words seemed to freeze the entire scene. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The cashier standing outside the store blinked in surprise. The older gentleman near his pickup slowly lowered his coffee cup. Even the breeze that had been rustling the flags moments earlier felt insignificant against the sudden stillness. Linda stared at me without saying a word, her confident smile disappearing almost instantly. She looked back toward Officer Collins, then toward Officer Brooks, searching their faces for some sign that this had to be a misunderstanding. Officer Brooks stood a little straighter without becoming stiff. Good morning, Chief, he said. I apologize for not recognizing you immediately. I shook my head gently. There is nothing to apologize for. You both handled the call exactly as you should have. That answer seemed to surprise several people listening nearby, but it was the only correct response. Professionalism does not change because of titles. If anything, titles demand even greater discipline. Linda finally found her voice. Chief, she repeated quietly, almost as if the word itself refused to make sense. Police chief. I met her eyes for the first time since the officers had arrived. Yes. She laughed once, but it sounded forced rather than confident. Well, if that is true, why did you not say something earlier? Because my position was never supposed to determine whether the facts mattered, I answered calmly. If I had introduced myself immediately, this would have become a conversation about rank instead of truth. No one argued with that. Officer Collins closed her notebook and nodded almost imperceptibly, as though the statement confirmed exactly why I had earned the responsibility I carried. Linda shifted uneasily where she stood. Only minutes earlier, she had been speaking as though she could direct the officers herself. Now she seemed unsure whether to continue talking at all. I did not know, she said. That is true, I replied. But you also did not ask. The crowd remained silent, listening carefully. I continued in the same measured tone. More importantly, every person deserves fairness before anyone knows what job they have. Whether someone is a police chief, a teacher, a mechanic, or a retiree should never change how they are treated. Carl, the station manager, quietly nodded from near the store entrance. Several customers exchanged thoughtful glances. The conversation had shifted completely away from gasoline. It had become something much larger, a lesson unfolding in real time. Linda attempted to recover her confidence. This has all been a misunderstanding, she said with an uneasy smile. I simply wanted community cooperation. Officer Brooks responded politely. That is exactly why we are gathering all available information before reaching any conclusions. She looked at him with visible surprise. You are still investigating? Yes, ma'am, he answered. Our responsibility has not changed. I could not have asked for a better response. The reveal had changed the atmosphere, but it had not changed the process. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I looked toward both officers. Please continue exactly as you intended before recognizing me. Review the video, speak with every witness, and document everything. The investigation deserves the same standards as any other call. Absolutely, Chief, Officer Collins replied. Linda lowered her eyes for the first time that morning. The confidence she had displayed only moments earlier had been replaced by something far less comfortable. She was beginning to understand that the greatest surprise was not that she had called officers on the police chief. The greater surprise was that the police chief had never needed his title to remain calm, and now that everyone knew who he was, the only thing that truly mattered was allowing the evidence to tell the story. Officer Collins thanked Carl and followed him inside the convenience store to review the security footage while Officer Brooks remained outside with the rest of us, continuing to document the incident exactly as department policy required. I appreciated seeing the process unfold without shortcuts because procedures only earn public trust when they are followed consistently, especially in situations that attract attention. Linda stood quietly beside her sport utility vehicle, no longer speaking with the certainty that had filled the parking lot only minutes earlier. She glanced toward the store entrance several times, as though hoping the video would somehow support the version of events she had described. The customers who had remained nearby continued watching, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of waiting for someone to win an argument, everyone was waiting for facts. Nearly 10 minutes passed before Officer Collins returned carrying a small notepad. Her expression remained calm and professional, but there was no hesitation in her voice when she began summarizing what the cameras had recorded. The video confirms that Mr. Walker arrived first, paid for his own fuel, and remained beside his vehicle throughout the encounter, she said. It also confirms that Ms. Harper requested that he purchase gasoline for her vehicle. After he declined, there was an extended verbal disagreement. No threatening behavior was observed from Mr. Walker. Linda immediately stepped forward. The cameras cannot capture everything, she protested. You had to hear the way he was speaking to me. Officer Collins nodded respectfully. That is why we also interviewed witnesses. She opened her notebook. The station manager and 3 customers independently described the same sequence of events shown on the video. Linda's shoulders stiffened. They are strangers. They do not understand our neighborhood. Carl answered before anyone else could. Ma'am, we understand what we watched. His words were not emotional or confrontational. They were simply factual. Officer Brooks then asked a question that shifted the investigation even further. Ms. Harper, you stated that this business participates in an agreement requiring free gasoline for the Homeowners Association. Can you provide documentation confirming that claim? Linda hesitated again. Not with me. Can the station owner confirm such an agreement? Brooks continued. Carl answered immediately. No, because no such agreement exists. We have never offered complimentary fuel to any Homeowners Association board member or resident. Brooks made another note. Linda looked visibly uncomfortable. Perhaps I misunderstood the arrangement, she said. It was the first time that morning she had moved away from absolute certainty. Officer Collins continued carefully. We also reviewed the portion of the recording where emergency services were contacted. During that call, you reported an aggressive individual creating a disturbance. She paused briefly before continuing. The video reviewed so far does not appear to support that description. Linda looked toward me before quickly looking away again. I felt intimidated, she replied quietly. Feeling uncomfortable is important information. Officer Collins answered with genuine respect. However, our responsibility is to distinguish between personal perceptions and observable facts. That sentence settled over the crowd with remarkable clarity. Nobody interrupted because everyone understood exactly why those words mattered. Public confidence depends upon investigations being guided by evidence rather than assumptions. Officer Brooks then turned toward me. Chief, with your permission, I would like to complete this call exactly as any other responding officer would. I nodded immediately. That is precisely what should happen. My role today is the same as every other citizen involved in an investigation. I am a participant, not the supervisor of this incident. Brooks smiled slightly. Understood. Linda seemed genuinely surprised by that exchange. She had expected my position to end the investigation in my favor. Instead, it had done the opposite by reinforcing that the investigation had to remain impartial. She finally spoke in a noticeably softer voice. I was frustrated, she admitted. I believed he should have helped. Being frustrated is understandable, I replied. Expecting another customer to pay for your gasoline is a separate issue. She did not respond. For several seconds, the only sounds were passing traffic and the distant hum of the refrigeration units behind the convenience store. Officer Collins finished reviewing her notes before closing the notebook. Based upon the evidence available at this time, there is no indication that Mr. Walker committed any violation requiring enforcement action. The reported disturbance appears to have resulted from a disagreement that escalated after the request for complimentary gasoline was declined. Several people quietly nodded. The conclusion matched exactly what they had witnessed from beginning to end. Yet I could tell the morning was still not over. During the witness interviews, Carl had privately mentioned that this was not the first disagreement involving Linda and local businesses. Officer Collins exchanged a brief glance with Officer Brooks, and I recognized that look immediately. Experienced officers develop it after years of working together. It is the silent acknowledgement that one incident may be connected to a larger pattern, and that before anyone leaves the scene, there are a few more careful questions that deserve thoughtful answers. Officer Brooks waited until every witness statement had been documented before asking Carl one final question. You mentioned this was not the first disagreement involving Ms. Harper. Would you be willing to explain what you meant? Carl glanced toward Linda for a moment before answering. Only because you asked, officer. Over the last year, a few local businesses have mentioned similar situations. Nothing exactly like today, but there have been requests for complimentary products, discounts, or special treatment because of the homeowners association. Most owners simply gave in because they did not want conflict. Linda immediately shook her head. That is a completely unfair way to describe community partnerships. Carl remained respectful. Maybe that was your intention, but that is not how everyone experienced it. The older gentleman in the baseball cap slowly raised his hand as though he were sitting in a town meeting instead of standing beside a gas pump. If it helps, I have seen something similar myself. Officer Collins thanked him and invited him to speak. A few months ago, he explained, I own the hardware store about 2 miles from here. Ms. Harper asked whether the association could receive landscaping supplies without charge because it would improve neighborhood appearance. When I explained that I could offer a normal business discount, but not free merchandise, she became upset and suggested the association might recommend that residents shop elsewhere. Linda quickly turned toward him. That was never a threat. The gentleman answered calmly. Perhaps not intentionally, but it certainly sounded like one. Officer Collins carefully recorded every statement without interruption. She made no assumptions and offered no conclusions. She simply allowed each witness to describe what they had personally experienced. Moments later, the delivery driver who had been quietly observing stepped forward as well. I deliver office supplies around town, he said. I have heard business owners talking about the homeowners association before. They usually say it is easier to agree than argue. Linda folded her arms again, but the confidence from earlier that morning was gone. People are exaggerating isolated conversations, she insisted. Everything I have ever done has been to benefit the community. I believed she probably did see herself that way. That is one of the more complicated lessons learned after years in law enforcement. Very few people wake up intending to misuse authority. More often, they slowly become convinced that their goals justify their methods. Over time, requests begin sounding like expectations, expectations become demands, and eventually those demands feel completely reasonable to the person making them. Officer Brooks closed his notebook for a moment before asking another careful question. Ms. Harper, have you ever informed business owners that declining these requests could affect their relationship with the association? She hesitated noticeably. I may have discussed community support. Did those discussions include possible consequences? Brooks asked. I encouraged cooperation, she answered without directly responding. Neither officer pressed further. They had already learned enough to understand that today's disagreement might represent part of a broader pattern, but determining that pattern would require additional review after the call concluded. Officer Collins looked toward me. Chief, would you like us to contact the department's Community Relations Unit regarding these concerns? I considered the question for only a moment. Yes, not because of who is involved today, but because several independent business owners have now described similar experiences. If there is a misunderstanding between the association and local businesses, it deserves to be addressed through the appropriate channels. Carl nodded appreciatively. That would help a lot of people. Linda looked genuinely surprised. You are opening another investigation over this? No, I answered calmly. We are documenting information that has been voluntarily provided. Whether any additional review becomes necessary will depend on evidence, not assumptions. That distinction mattered. Every action had to remain measured, fair, and supported by facts. The customers listening nearby seemed to recognize that as well. No one cheered. No one mocked Linda. Instead, the atmosphere became unexpectedly thoughtful. The conversation had moved far beyond one tank of gasoline. It had become a reminder that authority, whether held by a homeowners association, a business owner, or a public official, carries responsibilities that are easy to overlook when nobody questions them. Officer Brooks finished the final witness statement and placed his notebook back into his uniform pocket. Thank you, everyone, he said. Your cooperation has been very helpful. Linda stood quietly beside her vehicle, looking across the parking lot with an expression that was completely different from the one she had worn less than an hour earlier. For the first time since approaching my truck, she seemed less concerned about proving herself right and more concerned about understanding how a simple request had gradually unfolded into a public lesson about accountability, evidence, and the limits of authority. The patrol officers concluded the initial investigation only after every available fact had been documented, every willing witness had been heard, and every piece of readily available evidence had been preserved. There was no celebration because there was nothing to celebrate. A disagreement had exposed something much larger than a simple misunderstanding, and everyone standing beneath that gas station canopy seemed to understand it. Officer Collins handed Carl a small card containing the incident number. If the owner would like to provide any additional documentation or copies of previous communications, they can be attached to today's report, she explained. Carl accepted it with an appreciative nod. I think you will want to do that. There have been a few emails over the past year that suddenly seem much more important than they did yesterday. Linda looked toward him with visible surprise. Emails? Carl answered honestly. Requests for complimentary products, preferred treatment, and reminders about supporting the association. I never thought much about them because we simply declined, but they are still in our records. Officer Brooks quietly noted that information. If the business owner wishes to share them voluntarily, they may help establish the overall timeline. Linda lowered her eyes for a moment. None of those messages were intended to pressure anyone. I answered gently instead of critically. Intent matters, but so does impact. Sometimes people experience the same words very differently than we expect. She did not argue. That alone was a remarkable change from the woman who had confidently declared herself beyond question less than an hour earlier. Several residents who had stopped for fuel during the incident slowly approached the officers with questions of their own. One woman asked whether homeowners associations actually had authority over private businesses located outside neighborhood property. Officer Collins explained carefully that associations operate according to their governing documents and applicable law, but they generally do not possess authority to require unrelated businesses to provide free goods or services simply because someone represents an association. The explanation was calm, educational, and completely free of judgment. More than one person quietly nodded as though a long-standing misunderstanding had finally been clarified. Before anyone left, Carl disappeared briefly into the convenience store and returned carrying a sealed envelope. "This contains printed copies of the emails I mentioned," he said. "The owner asked me to provide them if the officers believed they were relevant." Officer Brooks accepted the envelope without opening it. "Thank you. It will be logged according to standard procedure." Linda watched the exchange silently. Her confidence had been replaced by reflection. She finally spoke in a noticeably quieter voice. "I never expected any of this to happen today." "Neither did I admitted. "I only stopped to buy gasoline." For the first time that morning, a faint, embarrassed smile crossed her face before quickly disappearing. "I suppose this became much bigger than it needed to be." "It became exactly as large as each decision allowed it to become," I replied. "Every choice opened the door to the next one." Those words seemed to linger in the morning air. They were not directed only at Linda. They applied equally to anyone who carried responsibility over others, including me. Officer Collins finished organizing her notes before speaking once more. "The report will accurately reflect today's evidence. Any additional concerns involving previous interactions will be reviewed through the appropriate administrative channels if supporting documentation is provided." It was an ordinary statement from a professional officer, yet it carried an extraordinary message. Accountability does not arrive through dramatic speeches. It arrives through careful documentation, patient investigation, and a willingness to let facts speak louder than assumptions. Linda looked toward the small crowd that had gathered throughout the morning. "I owe several people conversations that should have happened a long time ago," she said quietly. Nobody responded with applause or criticism. The silence itself carried respect because genuine reflection rarely requires an audience. Carl extended his hand toward her after a brief pause. "I think honest conversations are a good place to start." After a moment of hesitation, she accepted the handshake. It did not erase what had happened, nor did it resolve every concern that had surfaced that morning. It simply marked the first step toward rebuilding trust. As the witnesses gradually returned to their vehicles and ordinary Saturday routines resumed, the gas station once again sounded like every other neighborhood stop along a quiet American road. The fuel pumps clicked, car doors closed, coffee cups changed hands, and traffic flowed steadily beyond the entrance. Yet everyone who had stood there understood they had witnessed something far more valuable than an argument ending. They had watched evidence replace assumptions, patience overcome pride, and the rule of law quietly remind an entire community that no position, title, or organization should ever stand above fairness, accountability, and simple respect for another person. 3 weeks passed before I saw Linda Harper again, and the setting could not have been more different. Instead of a crowded gas station filled with uncertainty, we were standing inside the Willow Creek Estates Community Clubhouse during an open homeowners association meeting attended by residents, board members, and several local business owners who had accepted invitations to share their experiences. I was there as a resident, not as the police chief, because the purpose of the meeting was not law enforcement. It was accountability, transparency, and rebuilding trust within a community that had quietly grown accustomed to confusing influence with authority. The events from that Saturday morning had never become a sensational headline, and I was grateful for that. The responding officers completed their report according to department policy. The additional emails and voluntary documentation submitted by local businesses were forwarded through the appropriate administrative channels for review. At the same time, the Homeowners Association Board conducted its own internal evaluation after several residents requested greater transparency regarding interactions with local businesses. The process took time, exactly as responsible processes should. No one rushed toward conclusions simply because emotions were involved. During that period, several business owners voluntarily described positive relationships they wanted to preserve while also explaining situations where they had felt uncomfortable declining requests connected to the association. None of them wanted conflict. They simply wanted clear boundaries and mutual respect. Those conversations accomplished something no argument ever could. They replaced assumptions with understanding. During the meeting, the board chair stood and announced several policy changes approved by unanimous vote. Future communications with businesses would require written authorization from the board instead of individual requests. Any partnership involving donations, discounts, or community events would be entirely voluntary and documented in writing. Training on ethical leadership and responsible governance would also become mandatory for future board members. They were practical changes, not dramatic ones, but practical improvements often create the strongest foundations. Linda then stood slowly from her chair. The confidence that had once filled every sentence she spoke had been replaced by humility. She looked around the room before taking a slow breath. I spent a long time believing that because I cared deeply about this neighborhood, every decision I made was automatically justified, she admitted. I have learned that good intentions never replace the need for respect, clear boundaries, and accountability. For the situations where my actions caused frustration or made anyone feel pressured, I sincerely apologize. The room remained quiet. No one interrupted her. No one applauded. An honest apology deserves the dignity of being heard without becoming a performance. After she finished speaking, the board confirmed that she had voluntarily stepped down as president and would assist with an orderly leadership transition while new elections were organized according to the association's governing documents. It was not a punishment delivered through anger. It was a responsibility accepted through accountability. As the meeting concluded, several business owners approached one another for the first time not as opposing sides, but as neighbors. Carl from the gas station shook hands with the owner of the hardware store. Residents exchanged ideas for future community events that would support local businesses instead of placing expectations upon them. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in years because trust had finally begun replacing assumption. As I walked toward the parking lot, I heard someone call my name. It was Linda. She caught up to me with a thoughtful expression. "Chief Walker," she said. "I have been thinking about one question ever since that morning." I smiled. "Which question is that?" She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "Why did you stay so calm when I called the police?" I looked across the parking lot where families were loading groceries into their vehicles. Children were laughing near the sidewalk, and neighbors were holding ordinary conversations that reminded me exactly why communities matter. "Because the badge is not supposed to protect me from the truth," I answered. "It is supposed to protect the truth from everyone, including me. If respect only appears after people learn your title, then they never respected the person in the first place." She nodded slowly, thanked me, and walked back toward the clubhouse. I climbed into my old silver pickup, the same truck that had started this entire story over one ordinary tank of gasoline. As I drove past the entrance to Willow Creek Estates, I noticed a newly installed community sign that had not been there before. Beneath the neighborhood name was a simple line approved by the new board after suggestions from both residents and business owners. It read, "Strong communities are built through respect, fairness, and service." I smiled because those 12 words captured everything that had happened far better than any official report ever could. Looking back now, people often ask whether the most important moment was when the officers recognized me as the police chief. It was not. The most important moment came long before that, when I chose not to reveal who I was and allowed character to speak before authority. Badges can earn attention, titles can command a room, but neither has the power to create genuine respect. Only integrity can do that, and integrity does not become stronger when someone is watching. It simply becomes visible. That morning began with a request for free gasoline, but it ended with something infinitely more valuable. An entire community remembered that justice does not have to be loud. Revenge is never the goal, and the strongest form of authority will always be the quiet decision to let truth, fairness, and the law lead the way.